In the last session, we looked at the general structure of the Passion narrative in Mark's Gospel. Then we discussed the Gethsemane scene and the arrest. This was followed by a treatment of the Jewish or the Sanhedrin trial with the narrative of Peter's denial. In the current session, we shall continue our discussion of the Passion narrative in Mark's Gospel, looking at the Roman trial, or the trial before Pilate, which includes the Barabbas scene. This will be followed by an examination of the way of the cross, or the Via Dolorosa, and the crucifixion scene. Finally, we shall conclude our discussion of the Passion narrative with the narrative of Jesus' burial. Mark is the only one of the four Gospels that has a double hearing before the Sanhedrin. The first, which took place during the night, was treated in the previous session. The second takes place as soon as morning came. It is described as a consultation, that is, a counseling with or a deciding with, as we shall see from the Greek word symbulion. Oh yeah, there's that Greek again. The participants in this decision are described as the chief priests with the elders and the scribes. In other words, the whole Sanhedrin. They have met throughout the night, and now in the morning they come to a decision. The decision of the Sanhedrin is that he is worthy of death. However, they are by Roman law not permitted to execute a sentence of death, and therefore they must now turn Jesus over to the Roman authorities. Therefore they bind Jesus again and lead him away to hand him over to Pilate, the current Roman governor of the region. It is generally believed that when he was in Jerusalem, Pilate worked from the fortress Antonia on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. Within the confines of the fortress Antonia was the judgment hall of the governor, known also as the Praetorium. This is a picture of the northern section of the city of Jerusalem as it appears in the model of New Testament Jerusalem. In the immediate foreground, we see the tile roofs of the dual pools of Bethzatha. Immediately above the pools, in the very center of the picture, are four rather large towers. These towers mark the fortress Antonia at the north end of the Temple Mount. If you look to the left of the fortress Antonia, the Temple of Jerusalem is visible. In the Markan version of the Roman trial, Pilate initiates the questioning with a very pointed question. Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus responds with an almost flippant, you say so. In other words, Jesus says, that's your opinion. He does not answer the governor's question. But in accord with Roman and Jewish law, he does not have to answer a question which would be self-incriminating. The title King of the Jews was used among the Romans to designate a political entity who led the Jewish people. For example, Herod the Great had the title King of the Jews among the Romans. Thus, a pretender to this title could be construed as a threat to Roman rule. It is curious that both the questions of Pilate and the answer of Jesus are an emphatic you yourself. You yourself are the one. Meanwhile, the leaders of the Jews, the chief priests, are making various accusations against Jesus. To quell the din of the leaders' accusations, Pilate once again questions Jesus. Have you no answer? Again, realizing that he's not obliged by law to incriminate himself, Jesus gave no further answer. He remained silent. This is also seen by many at the time as a reference to the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53:7 speaks of the servant being harshly treated, yet he submitted and opened not his mouth. The result is Pilate was amazed. Actually, he was astonished. marveling at why Jesus would say nothing. Pilate deep down senses the innocence of Jesus, but he also fears the Jewish leaders, and so he vacillates. Yet there might be a way out that would save face for both Pilate and the Jewish leaders without crucifying Jesus. Mark recalls that on the occasion of the feast, that is, the Passover, Pilate was accustomed to release to the people one prisoner of their choice. This had the name of the privilegium paschale, that is, the paschal privilege. The interesting thing is that there is no extra biblical evidence of such a privilege, save references to this scene in the Passion narrative. Also, given the volatility of Palestine in those days, such a privilege would be counterproductive. Pilate and his soldiers may have spent significant amounts of time to get these insurrectionists rounded up and imprisoned. Would he then freely release one of them to the crowd and start the process all over again? Nevertheless, Mark tells us that Pilate invokes the privilege in hopes of being able to release Jesus. Now, there was a man named Barabbas in prison, along with the rebels who were imprisoned for committing murder in an insurrection against the Romans. The crowd initiates the action here. They approach Pilate and request that he do as was his custom. Pilate responds, offering to release Jesus, the King of the Jews. Mark then adds a side note. Pilate knew that it was out of envy the chief priests had handed Jesus over. But before anyone could answer Pilate's question, the chief priests ensure that their answer will be the one given. They incite the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas. Knowing that the mob is becoming angrier and angrier, Pilate questions, "What do you want me to do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" In other words, what should happen to Jesus? In unison, they shout out, "Crucify him." This elicits the response of "Why?" from Pilate. Again, Pilate has seen nothing worthy of crucifixion, and surely the crowd must have a reason for such a demand. "What evil has he done?" Pilate asks. They do not answer. All they can do is shout all the louder, "Crucify him." This shows the real purpose of the Barabbas scene in the Markan narrative. Through this scene, the blame for the crucifixion of Jesus is shifted from the Romans and Pilate to the Jews and the Sanhedrin. So Pilate gives in to the crowd of Barabbas' sympathizers and chief priests and Sanhedrin representatives and releases Barabbas. Again, giving in to the crowd, he utters the dreaded words, "Ibis ad crucem," "You will go to the cross," to Jesus, and hands him over to the executioners to begin the process of crucifixion with the scourging. The soldiers charged with the execution lead Jesus into the praetorium, the palace, and they assemble the entire cohort. Now, the cohort would be 1/10 of a Roman legion. Hence, it could number between 200 and 600 men. This was something that could not be missed, and hence the whole battalion was summoned to take part in the mockery about to begin. As the mockery and the scourging begin, they clothe Jesus in purple and weave a crown of thorns to place on his head. He's supposed to be King of the Jews, and so they must treat him as such. Here is a picture of what many think the scourges looked like. Note the metal at the ends of the whip cords. These were meant to rip into the skin and cause major damage and bleeding. The crown of thorns is not the little rosebush thorn crown that we have seen in many illustrations of the crucifixion. It was more likely a helmet type of crown, made with strong thorns several inches in length, which were then driven into the head, producing maximum pain. The soldiers salute him with "Hail, King of the Jews," in mockery of the salutation given to Caesar. They strike his head with a reed and spit on him, kneeling before him in mock homage. When they had had their fill of the mockery, they removed the purple cloak and dressed him in his own clothes and lead him out to be crucified. This is a picture of the stone pavement, known in Greek as the lithostratos, from the Greek words lithos, meaning pavement or stone, and stratos, meaning pavement. This is where Pilate condemned Jesus to die. On the wall of the area is a mosaic of Jesus receiving his cross. Where the gentleman is standing is considered to be a part of the original stone pavement from the time of Pilate, complete with an authentic first-century heating grate. Well, not really. This map of Jerusalem shows the city at the time of Jesus. The original wall of Jesus' day would be the wall surrounding the new city. You will notice that Golgotha Hill and the later Church of the Holy Sepulchre are outside of that wall, but inside the wall of 44 BC, which was built during the time of Herod Agrippa IV. The 44 BC wall is the one enclosing the area at the top called Bethesda. So it is surmised that Jesus left the fortress Antonia through the entrance into the new city, and then carried his cross through the new city to the Ganath Gate, the gate where the north-south wall of the city meets the east-west wall, just below the John the Baptist Church. Passing outside the city through the Ganath Gate, he would then have traveled up the hill to the hill of Golgotha, where he was crucified. This is the way that is traversed in the modern Via Dolorosa for pilgrims who visit the city of Jerusalem. Here is a picture of the Chapel of Condemnation on the grounds of the Convent of the Sisters of Zion. The Gospel of Mark says very little about the way of the cross, especially the events contained in the devotion we call today the Stations of the Cross. All that Mark notes about that is that Jesus was quite weak from the scourging, most likely, and it was necessary to compel a passerby to assist Jesus in carrying his cross. His name is given as Simon of Cyrene. Simon is simply described as a man coming from the country who is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Presumably these would have been known to the hearers of the Gospel of Mark. Continuing on, this is a picture of the site commemorating the second station of the cross. Jesus receives and carries his cross. This would mark the beginning of that dreadful final walk of Jesus known as the Via Dolorosa, or the Sorrowful Way. Today, pilgrims to the city of Jerusalem walk the way of the cross, as does this pilgrim group. They sometimes have various members of the group carry the cross, as can be seen in the front of the group. After passing through one of the main marketplaces in Jerusalem, known as the Souk, the way of the cross makes a sharp bend to this street, which also begins the rise to the Mount of Golgotha, as can be seen in the steps. As you make the turn, there is a small chapel commemorating the fourth station, where Jesus meets his mother. As Golgotha gets closer, the incline becomes steeper as one passes the chapel commemorating the sixth station. Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. Finally, the destination is reached, Golgotha. Today, the hill of Golgotha is where the great Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre, built by Constantine in the 4th century, stands. It's within this church that one finds the final 5 stations of the Way of the Cross. The whole Way of the Cross is summarized by Mark when he says they brought Jesus to the place of the skull called Golgotha. Upon arrival, they offered him wine mingled with myrrh. This is seen as an anesthetic or a sedative to dull the pain of the nails being driven into his hands and his feet. Yet Mark notes he did not take it. Mark states in stark simplicity, they crucified him. The narrative continues with the prerogative of the soldiers who crucify. They're allowed to divide the earthly belongings of the crucified among them. This is accomplished by the casting of lots. It's seen as a fulfillment of what the psalmist said in Psalm 22:18. They divided my garments among them, and for my raiment they cast lots. The crucified must divest himself of everything, including his human dignity. Mark announces that the crucifixion took place at the 3rd hour, which would be 9 o'clock in the morning. Matthew and Luke do not give a note of the hour. John says it was the 6th hour, which would be noon. Interpreters of Mark say that the 3rd hour would be consistent with the note that the trial before Pilate began early in the morning. Thus, it would be over, and Jesus could be crucified at 9 o'clock. Finally, each crucified person was required to carry an inscription, many times hung around his neck, describing the crime for which he was being crucified. This inscription, or titulus, was then nailed to the cross for all passers-by to see. In his discussion of the crucifixion, John mentions that this inscription was in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, all the languages of the people who may be around the crucifixion site. Mark notes that the titulus for Jesus was simple. It read simply, "The King of the Jews." This was the political charge which was brought to Pilate. A further word on the inscription, or the titulus. Most crucifixes have a small scroll over the head of Jesus, with the letters INRI on it. These are the first letters of the charge as it's narrated by John. It stands for Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Note, John gives Jesus' name in addition to the charge. In Latin, that would be Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum. With the first letters being highlighted in red on the slide, you can see where we get the INRI. A rendition of such a titulus might look like this, with the Hebrew on the top, the Latin in the middle, and the Greek on the bottom. A further note on the crucifixion. Jesus was not crucified alone. There were 2 others with him, one on his right and one on his left. Thus we see the origin of pictures of the crucifixion, with 2 robbers on either side with Jesus in the middle. If you recall, the phrase one on the right and one on the left has already appeared in the gospel in the narrative of the request of James and John in chapter 10. There, James and John had requested to sit, one at Jesus' right and one at his left, when he entered into his glory. Jesus makes it clear that their request is not his to grant. It is, quote, for those for whom it has been prepared. We now see who those are. This only serves to confirm the interpretation that Jesus is asking James and John if they are willing to suffer with him. The cup they said that they were willing to drink is the cup of the crucifixion, which clearly they were not willing to drink. Since they're not here, they have fled. Inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre are the 10th to the 14th stations. Up a flight of stairs, one comes to Golgotha with stations 10, 11, and 12. The 10th station is located in a very difficult-to-reach chapel and can be seen only through a window. At the site of the 11th station, there are two mosaics. The first depicts an Old Testament antecedent to the crucifixion, the binding of Isaac. The early church drew many parallels between Abraham's offering up of Isaac and the Father's offering up of Jesus. The second mosaic is Jesus being nailed to the cross. It is the altar that we celebrate Mass to commemorate the crucifixion. Next to the 11th station is the 12th station, depicted by a marble altar, which has a place to reach through to touch where the cross stood. The Orthodox altar is dominated by a large cross with two silver-garbed angels on either side. Hanging overhead are many, many oil lamps. The crucifixion narrative continues with the mocking of Jesus on the cross. This takes place at the hands of many groups. Alluding to Psalm 22:7, and those passing by were ridiculing him, wagging their heads. Thus, the people who happened to be passing by derided him, wagging their heads and saying in a derisive tone, referring to the charges that were brought before the Sanhedrin. Okay, they say, you who would destroy the temple, rebuild it in 3 days. Let's see what you're made of. Save yourself and come down from that cross. They know right well that he's not going to do any such thing. They're just mocking him. The next group to share in this mockery is the group that set the Passion in motion, the Jewish leaders, the chief priests and the scribes. They make reference to Jesus' ministry of saving others. He saved others. Himself he cannot save. Then they half-heartedly say, let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. From the titles used to the intonation of voice, one can see the sarcasm dripping in their words. Let the Christ, who is no Christ, the King of Israel, who's no king, come down that we may see and believe, as if that would ever happen. The final group in Mark to participate in the mockery are those who were crucified with Jesus. This contrasts with Luke, who has one of those crucified mocking, but he's rebuked by the other, who asks Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom. Mark has Jesus totally alone. Everyone seems to be against him, even those under the same sentence as he. Mark notes that it is the 6th hour, and from the 6th hour, that is noon, to the 9th hour, that is 3 o'clock, darkness covered the whole land. This reference from noon to 3 o'clock gives rise to the Traore, or the watchful prayer, commemorating the final hours of Jesus' life. At the 9th hour, Jesus cries out in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is the opening line of Psalm 22. It's seen by some as the final cry of exasperation, that even the Father has deserted Jesus. especially since the cry is answered by silence. But others see the opening line of the psalm as referring to the whole psalm. And Psalm 22 is a psalm of anguish of one who is oppressed, but it also ends with a note of confidence that God will deliver. But those at the cross are not that theologically inclined. They hear what they think is a call for Elijah. Eloi in Aramaic is very close to Eli, the first two syllables of the name Elijah in Hebrew. How does Elijah fit into this? Well, it was a belief that in the final days, if the Messiah found himself in difficulty, Elijah would come to his aid. In response to Jesus' cry, one of them fills a sponge full of vinegar, which he puts on a reed and raises to Jesus' lips. This is a reference to Psalm 69:21. They have given me vinegar to drink. However, at the very last moment, he delays. Wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to take him down. What seemed to be a final gesture of compassion has once again turned into mockery and pain. This is enough for Jesus, who with a loud cry breathes his last. The end has been achieved. With a great shout, Jesus dies. The verb for his death is ekpneo, meaning to breathe out or expire. The spirit is breathed out of Jesus' body with a great shout. Thus, as Craig Evans describes it, his very death displays his power. Jesus' death is followed by a number of spectacular occurrences. First, the veil of the temple, which separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place, was torn in two. The designation from top to bottom signifies that this is a complete tear. Also, top to bottom implies that the cause is God. Later theology will see this as the fact that the barriers that kept God from being among humanity have been destroyed. In the crucified Jesus, access to God the Father is possible. Second, the centurion who was in charge of the execution saw Jesus breathe his last, and in the ensuing action of the temple of Jerusalem. This was enough for him to make the rather climactic profession, truly this man was a Son of God. This was no ordinary human being, or even ordinary criminal who was crucified. He is truly extraordinary. He is the Son of God. Thus, the centurion's declaration forms a bookend with the declaration of the voice from heaven at the beginning of the gospel. Evans notes that in this statement, the centurion has switched his allegiance from Caesar, the official Son of God, to Jesus as the real Son of God. Thus, the centurion ascribes to Jesus what he had already ascribed to Caesar. Further, Mark mentions the fact that there were women looking on from afar. This provides a bridge between the Passion narrative and the coming resurrection narrative. These women are witnesses to the Passion, yet they also take note of where the body has been laid, so they will be the first to hear the great news of the resurrection. They're then named Mary Magdalene, that is, Mary who comes from the town of Magdala. She's prominent in the gospel traditions, especially in the Passion and Resurrection traditions in the Gospel of John. Then Mary, the mother of James the Younger and Joses. In the Johannine tradition, she's called Mary, the wife of Clopas. And finally, Salome. If we look at the Matthean tradition, this Salome may be the unnamed mother of the sons of Zebedee mentioned in Matthew 27:56. These women are described as following Jesus and serving Jesus when he was in Galilee. The implication is that these women were disciples of Jesus. They are clearly people who, through their care and generosity, have made the ministry of Jesus possible. The mention of the women closes with a more generalized statement specifying that many other women who had also come up with him to Jerusalem. It's a strange contrast that the men of Jesus' party have all fled, while the women are looking on from afar as the Passion comes to a conclusion. Attention now turns to the burial. Evening has arrived. It was about 4 or 5 p.m. It was the day of preparation for the Sabbath. And so something had to be done with the body, since the Sabbath would begin about 6 p.m. So Joseph of Arimathea, who was described as a respected member of the council, that is the Sanhedrin, who was looking for the kingdom of God. Joseph is one of a group of Jews at that time who were secret followers of Jesus. They did not want their true allegiance to be known, for fear that it would endanger their status or even their lives. Brown refers to this group as crypto-Christians. This Joseph gets up courage and goes to Pilate with a request that he release the body of Jesus to Joseph for burial. Pilate is a bit taken aback by this request. Is this Jesus really dead? So Pilate summons the centurion, who was in charge of the execution of Jesus, and asks him whether Jesus had actually died. There are accounts of families who have taken their loved ones down from the cross while they were still alive, when the Roman sentry may have been away from his post. The centurion confirms that Jesus has indeed died, and so Pilate grants the body to Joseph. Joseph of Arimathea had already purchased a linen shroud, a sindone. Note that this Greek word is the same as the word describing the clothing of the young man in the garden. Then Joseph takes the body down and wraps it in the shroud. The body of Jesus is then laid in a tomb which had been hewn out of rock, and the stone is rolled against the entrance of the tomb. The death that Jesus underwent was clearly the death of a common criminal, capital punishment in the Roman Empire. But the burial that follows is quite different. With linen cloths and a rock-cut tomb, the burial is nothing but the finest saved only for royalty. Mark does not tell us whose tomb this was, but presumably it was Joseph's own. The Roman custom of the day required that the bodies of those crucified not be buried in a family tomb until 1 full year had passed, and the bones could be gathered together and placed in an ossuary. The shame of execution extended even into the period after death. This is a model of the tomb of Jesus. Imagine that this tomb was surrounded by rock. The stone to cover the entrance of the tomb was where the thumb of the hand holding it is. the stone is in the open position. In this photo, the stone is in the closed position, blocking the entrance to the tomb. Finally, we have a cutaway view where the two chambers of the tomb are visible. The larger chamber just inside the entrance is the mourner's chamber, where the family and friends can pray. Beyond the mourner's chamber is the chamber where the body would lie for the first year until the bones would be collected and put into an ossuary. Again, the stone against the tomb door is in the closed position. The Markan Passion narrative ends with note that two of the women who had been observing the crucifixion from a distance now note where the tomb of Jesus was and where he was laid. These two women were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph. They note the place so that when the Sabbath has ended, they can go out and get the necessary spices and continue the process of giving Jesus a proper burial. This verse also serves as a link between the crucifixion narrative and the narrative of the empty tomb, which we shall examine in our next session. To give an idea of the size of the stone that was in front of the tomb, this is a typical rolling stone which would be used to close a tomb in the 1st century. This is a rock-cut tomb, which is also known as the Garden Tomb in the city of Jerusalem. It is thought by some to have been the tomb of Jesus. You can see the entrance cut into the rock. In front of the entrance there is a track on which the stone would roll to open and close the tomb. By the way, the step and the rubber mat are not original. The more traditional site for the tomb of Jesus is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It has been venerated as the spot since the time of Helena, the mother of Constantine. On the left is a picture of the Holy Sepulchre as it exists today. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is actually built around this tomb. On the right is a picture of Mass being celebrated in the mourner's chamber of the tomb. Beyond the mourner's chamber is the inner chamber where the body would have lain. Next session, we'll look at the resurrection and the empty tomb narrative.